Hello and welcome to the Redfern Arts Center on Brickyard Pond. Please turn off and put away cell phones, pagers, or any devices that make noise or light. They are a distraction to the performers and the people around you. Also, recording and photography of any kind is strictly prohibited. Please take this opportunity to familiarize yourself with the location of the exits. In the event of an emergency, please proceed calmly to the exit nearest you. Once outside, please move away from the building. Thank you. We hope you enjoy the performance.
Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Shannon Mayers. I'm the director of the Redfern Arts Center, and thank you so much for coming for this production of Telling Project Monadnock. You can learn more about the Telling Project in your show bill, but I just want to say I am so grateful to have found this project and to be able to connect with a community that I feel like the Redfern hasn't really connected with before about our veterans and hearing and listening to their stories tonight. I have many thanks for people who have, and organizations that have given their generous support. We have the New England Foundation for the Arts Expeditions Touring Program. We have New Hampshire Charitable Foundation, William T. Morris Foundation, CNS Wholesale Grocers, the Keene Sentinel, Fraser & Son Furniture. I'd also like to give a special thanks to the Historical Society of Cheshire County and the KSE Archives and Special Collections for providing these wonderful images and letters that are in our exhibit upstairs, paying tribute to the veterans of New Hampshire County, starting all the way from the Revolutionary War. I'd also like to thank Athens Pizza and the Works Cafe for helping feed our cast for some of our rehearsals. And I would especially like to thank HowlRound Theater Commons for live streaming the show tonight for a global audience. My personal thanks goes to Ron, Larry, Patty, Mike, Pam, Jim, Chris, Doug, and Eva for taking a leap of faith and going on this journey with me with this project starting in December when they all met and culminating in tonight. And for Max Raynard and Jonathan Way, Executive Director of the Telling Project, who is here tonight for creating this opportunity for veterans all over the country to share their stories with the community. Please join us afterwards for a talkback and reception with Jonathan and the cast after the show. This is a special project for me because it is about stories. My father was a Navy man, but I never know what his story was. He never talked about it. And I'm pretty inspired by this quote from Vietnam veteran and author Tim O'Brien, who wrote The Things They Carried. So I just want to share it with you. And sometimes remembering will lead to a story, which makes it forever. And that's what stories are for. Stories are for joining the past to the future. Stories are for those late hours in the night when you can't remember how you got from where you were to where you are. Stories are for eternity, when memory is erased, when there is nothing to remember except the story. Thank you so much and enjoy the performance.
We're ready back here. Let's see how you're doing out front. People in the back, eyes forward. You can't sit back there and not pay attention. Cell phones away. You heard them. Be careful with that camera. Make sure you get my good side, right? Okay. Looks like you're good to go. Hoo-ah!
My father never talked about his war. He was a senior over in Manchester, New Hampshire, late 1943. A year later, he's facing German tanks in the Battle of the Bulge. I do remember one thing he told me. He said he was taught that none of the Germans were Christian. He told me that every German home he went into had a crucifix on the wall. That always stuck with me. Like him, I was raised up in Manchester, New Hampshire. I came to Keene for the first time, 1965, to interview for school. I looked down that wide main street, that big white church. I thought, I could live here forever. I lasted 3 semesters at Keene State. I had a 2.8, a 1.8, and a 0.8, and I flunked out. I lost my draft deferment. This was back when the country used to ask something of its citizens. So I got a job, and then in late spring of '68, I said, I'll sign up for a couple of summer courses. This was on a Monday. On Tuesday, Dean Pierce calls me into his office, and he says, "You're not getting back in, Colby." And on Wednesday, I got my draft notice. 30 days later, I'm on my way to Fort Dix, New Jersey, July 17th, 1968, for basic training. Yeah.
Well, I was born in Texas. My dad worked for an oil company. Pretty much everybody's dad worked for an oil company. And it was kind of like being a military brat. I grew up all over the United States. Houston, Chicago, New Jersey, back to Houston, back to Chicago, Connecticut, Oklahoma. I attended 6 different elementary schools and 2 middle schools. But I lucked out and stayed in the same high school in Connecticut for all 4 years. In the fall of 1965, I went off to Union College in upstate New York. And the first week I was there, I signed up for Air Force ROTC. I hadn't planned to do that. It wasn't a patriotic sense of duty. It was the 60s, and I knew that when I graduated, I'd probably be drafted, so I thought, why not have some control over my future? Also, it was the first big decision of my life that I made completely on my own without my parents.
Well, I was born in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. My mother took me through the South as a wee infant, saw a family, then we moved up to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and then off to West Germany for 3 years of post-war occupation. My dad was a lifer, private to major, D-Day to Berlin, Incheon to the Yalu. When we came back from Germany, went to guard duty here in Keene, and he retired as a guard advisor. So I was here from '57 to '68, formative years. Went to school here, had my first girlfriend here, and then poof, we were gone. My dad had gotten himself in deep shit with his teaching job, and a 3,000-mile cure was in order. So I finished high school on the West Coast. Hey, Michael.
How are you, Rob?
All right. Finished high school on the West Coast at a community college, and in a fit of pique, because my parents would not co-sign a loan for me for a used motorcycle, I said, I'll show them.
You showed them.
I did. I joined the Navy. It was 1972, and I look back and I have no idea what kind of logic I was using back then, but there you have it.
Well, I'm from North Walpole, a small town about a half an hour north of here.
Yeah.
It was a great place to grow up. In many ways, it prepared me for the military. We were always competing in something, kind of a survival of the fittest on a really small scale. Participation trophies weren't handed out in that town. No. In high school, what do you got? Say again? I was in high school as the Vietnam War was coming to an end. I had 2 older brothers who got high draft lottery numbers and didn't have to serve. I'm very thankful for that. I didn't apply myself much in high school, to put it lightly. I kind of just muddled through. In my senior year, we received excused absences for recruiting visits, much like the college kids did for college visits. Well, after one of those visits, I came home and I said to my dad, who was a World War II veteran, guess what I did today?
I don't know. Did you actually go to school?
No, I joined the Army. I had no idea what I was doing. 30 days later, June 30th, 1975, 6 days after I graduated from high school, I was off to basic at Fort Dix, New Jersey.
Well, I was raised in Kensington, New Hampshire by teenage parents. The second of 5 kids, my mother taught me to always protect the family. My father's lesson was never say anything about anybody you wouldn't be willing to say to their face. They worked hard, but we were poor. I had no desire to go to college after high school. My sister had joined the Army when she graduated. My family, girls and boys weren't treated equal. Boys, as soon as they graduated from high school, they were sent right to work full-time in my father's construction company. Us girls were supposed to get married, have babies, and be productive members of society. My mom had always wanted to travel, so she told my sister to join the Army so that she could travel. I figured if she can do it, I can do it too. So I followed her into the Army.
Well, I was born in Woburn, Massachusetts, and my first home was in Wilmington. But we moved around a lot, even before my parents got divorced. I've lived around most of New Hampshire. We were a pretty dysfunctional family, and the closest thing I had to role models were my grandparents, who used to babysit me. They both fought Hitler. Granddad was a radio operator on a B-17, and Graham served in the Women's Corps of the Royal Canadian Air Force. When I was very young, he taught me to use many tools, including his drill press. Once I saw him melt down lead to make bullets for his Kentucky rifle, which he carried in Minuteman marches around Concord and Lexington. They both inspired me. I had trouble at home and at school. I was a loner and usually off by myself, tinkering or exploring the New England woods. My stepfather was abusive, and I didn't make too many friends in school, so in my senior year, I dropped out. I'd wanted to go to MIT and study artificial intelligence under Rodney Brooks, but I couldn't afford the tuition. The military, though, I thought would toughen me up and pay for college, so in 1988, I joined the Army.
Excellent. My story's a little different. When I was 9 or 10, my brother was drafted and sent to Vietnam. When he got back, he'd pulled inside himself. He slept with a gun under his pillow. We went to visit him so he could show us his slides of Hong Kong, but all his slides were of dead Viet Cong. It was very traumatic. My mother told us kids to get outside. That was the last I heard of it. To me, war was awful, and the military was awful. I went to high school in New Hampshire and got pregnant at 15 and married. I remember that my husband had to register for the draft and received a number. He went to college, so he had the reprieve of not having to go unless his number was drawn. But we did have that hanging over our heads for a year or two. Our son Robert was born in 1972. We divorced about 6 years, after about 6 years of marriage. I was 21. 7 years later, I married a widower with a son and daughter. We were together for 8 years, and then he died of a heart attack. His son went to live with aunt and uncle, and his daughter Carrie stayed with me. In December 1990, I went to a dance at the VFW. This is where I met my husband, Jay. He was in the Navy. He started calling me. He started coming from Groton, Connecticut. We met in December. In April, he asked me to marry him. He'd never been married before. He was ready. I guess I was ready again, too. So Carrie and I followed Jay to Groton, Connecticut, where he was stationed. So I married into the military. I never wore the uniform. I never took the oath. And I definitely didn't come in his sea bag.
All right, prepare for the oath. Line up. Give me 2 lines. Come on, make them neat. Make them neat. All right, stand at attention, please. Raise your right hand. Repeat after me. I do solemnly swear
I do solemnly swear
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America
against all enemies, foreign and domestic,
Against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same,
and that I will obey the orders of the President of the United States
And I will obey the orders of the President of the United States
and the orders of the officers appointed over me
and the orders of the officers appointed over me
according to regulations and the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
according to regulations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
So help me God.
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 So help me, God.
Fall out.
Going away was rough. I was leaving my family, my friends, and my high school girlfriend at the time. My dad dropped me off at Colleen's Corner, where we met the recruiter. It was the first time I had seen him with tears in his eyes. The second time was the day he died. It was 1975 and my hair was big. One plane and bus ride later, I was getting my head shaved.
I remember those first buzz cuts and the guys crying. It wasn't so traumatic for us females.
Fine. On the way to basic training, another guy from Manchester and I hit it off. After a full day of shots, haircuts, and yelling, we ended up bunkmates. That night, right before lights out, the drill instructor came into our room. He saw we knew each other, so he said, "Douglas, get the hell out!"
Lights out!
I cried that night, so lost, alone, so far from home. Then the next day, everything started.
It's nighttime when the buses drop you off. Neon lights reflect off the concrete. Everyone's nervous. Suddenly,
Move it! Get off my bus! What'd your mother raise you to be, tardy?
I thought, holy shit, what'd I get myself into?
Fall in! Pathetic. Dress right, dress! We're gonna have to work on that. Ready? Front!
I went to boot at Great Lakes, north of Chicago. We were a motley crew. Black guys, Hispanic guys, white kids, college kids. We were a bunch of boys in man bodies, doing probably the first manly thing we'd ever done. And thank God it was an orderly environment, because I couldn't have poured piss out of a boot with the directions written on the heel. And for some reason, they called us raisins.
Shut your mouth! No talking in my formation, raisin!
Sir, no sir?
Sir!
Ma'am, no ma'am?
Ma'am, do I look like an officer to you? No, I work for a living.
No sir. I'm confused, sir.
It's drill sergeant!
Yes, drill sergeant!
Right face! Column left, march! Left, you're rather left. An embarrassment to the United States military. Column left, march! Column left, march! Mama, can't you see?
Mama, can't you see
What the Army's done to me?
what the Army's done to me?
Mark time, march! Squad, halt! Left face! When I say fall out, you will fall out and prepare for your next unit of training. Fall out!
The worst thing I remember about basic training was the gas chamber. It's designed to give you confidence in your equipment. They line you up inside of a building.
Gas!
You're wearing gas masks. When it's your turn, you step up, you take the biggest breath you can, take off your masks, and the sergeant starts asking you questions.
Name, rank, serial number.
Claude Michael D.
At that first tiny breath, it's all over.
Colby Lawrence, US 51968388.
Your eyes turn to faucets and your nose floods snot right down the front of your shirt.
Name, rank, serial number. Go!
You're hit in the face with a canteen of water and you try your best to recover.
Fall in. Right face. Column left, march. Left. You didn't like home, so you left.
You're right.
You didn't like home, so you left.
You're right.
Column left, march. Column left, march. Sound off.
1, 2,
Sound again now.
3, 4.
Bring it on down.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Squad, halt. Right face. Parade, rest. course, I wasn't a drill instructor back in basic training. Back then, I didn't want to get noticed, but I was noticed. I was physically fit, and I listened and retained information. I was an honor graduate and promoted. It was all good. Excuse me now. Squad, attention! About face! Take seats!
As the war in Vietnam dragged on, ROTC became less and less popular on campus. Truth be told, I wasn't that into it myself. I didn't go out for the drill team. I didn't seek out command opportunities. I shined my shoes. I showed up for the mandatory classes and drills. And increasingly, I wondered, do I really want to do this? I remember conversations around the dinner table, particularly at my girlfriend's house. Kathy and I had dated through most of high school and college, and we've been married now for almost 49 years. Both of her parents had served during World War II, but even they were expressing doubts about Vietnam. And I wasn't immune to the cultural climate at the time. I was an English major. I played guitar, I sang, I co-founded a coffee house. We sat around playing Bob Dylan and Pete Seeger songs. Allen Ginsberg came to campus, and we invited him to come down, and he did, and read some of his beatnik poems to us. So junior year, I told my father how I was feeling. He discouraged me from quitting. I spoke to my ROTC commander. He was an Air Force colonel, of course. He wanted me to stay in the program. But he suggested that I make an appointment with the dean of students. And I did, and he was more neutral. He was a World War II veteran, but after a long talk, he said, "Jim, this is a decision of conscience. You're going to have to make this one yourself." So I decided that I would go to summer training camp and then make up my mind. Summer camp was ROTC's version of basic training, and it proved to be a very positive experience. Oh, they did silly things like cutting our hair short and making us march off demerits that we earned by not making our beds properly. But I felt respected by the officers and my fellow cadets and a part of a real team. And we got a ride in a jet. That was pretty amazing. Holy cow, I said. I'd be crazy not to do this. So I decided to stay and become an Air Force pilot.
After basic, I was assigned to advanced infantry training, Fort Polk, Louisiana. Tigerland, they called it. They had a Tigerland banner. Whenever you ran under the Tigerland banner, you had to growl like an animal. In some ways, Fort Polk was worse than the war. Like this one time on an overnight exercise, we're out in the middle of the woods, pitch black, paint on our faces, fires burning. It was like Lord of the Flies, almost. They took the weakest guy among us and made him kill a chicken by tearing his fucking head off. This was to teach us survival skills. After 9 weeks of that, I was assigned to sergeant school, NCO school, Fort Benning, Georgia, another 12-week course. I got about halfway through, and I realized that I was unwilling, unable, to tell some troop to walk point, disarm a booby trap. I would take the responsibility for myself, maybe. But I couldn't order somebody else and watch them get hurt or die. So I resigned my position. I got 30 days leave, and I was off to the war. It was May 1969. I was stationed at a base camp in the Mekong Delta near a village called Keene. I used to think of it as Keene. The Mekong Delta is flat, 2 or 3 feet above sea level, as far as the eye can see. It's dikes and it's rice paddies. We'd go out on riverboats. We'd go out on Huey helicopters. We'd go out on trucks. We'd set up ambushes. We'd do sweeps or both. These missions lasted 1 to 4 days, and we usually had no contact. We'd go back to base camp. We'd be there for a day, maybe two. We'd go out and do it all again. Everyone in wartime has hundreds of first-time moments. That first firefight, the first blood. Really, the first mission, we were walking in the jungle and we came to a stream, and just as I was about to step into it, a snake eeled into the water from the other side. So I raised my rifle up and I waded into the water and I waited for that snake to strike, but it didn't. Everyone in wartime has hundreds of first-time moments. Oh, I did that. Next line. Then there's the question, can I shoot somebody? Can I kill somebody? We had gotten off the chopper, see, and we're heading for a hooch, and out of the back end of the hooch, a guy ran for the jungle, and I raised my rifle, and I fired. Bang, bang, bang! I didn't have a thought. I had one thought. How come he didn't fall down dead? We proceeded into the jungle. I was third or fourth in line. We stopped for some reason. Just as I reached the body, it was lying face down. It was halfway in the water and it was halfway out. He had bullet holes stitched from his shoulder to his ass. Of course, came from forward. Make sure he's dead. He's dead, I yelled back. I really didn't want to put another bullet into him. Every month in my unit, if you had killed the most people, you got a Sat Kong patch and a trip to the beach. Sat Kong means kill Kong, and 1 month we won that patch. So we helicoptered to Vung Tau. Back at base camp that night, Randy and I were smoking marijuana. We hear a couple of guys in the hallway, and they're yucking it up. What's up, you guys? We made up a Sat Baby Son badge, and we gave it to Jonesy. See, Jonesy had killed a little girl in a free fire zone some nights before. Oh, God, what did Jonesy do? He broke down. He broke down bawling. Well, we laughed and we laughed and we laughed. That's what you become. A little girl is dead. Jonesy gets to live with that horror for the rest of his life. I get to remember it forever.
There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware.
In June of 1969, I graduated from Union College, and the same day I was commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Air Force. I had orders to report to Columbus Air Force Base at the end of August to commence pilot training. I spent the rest of that summer going to the beach, going to friends' weddings, and painting Kathy's parents' house. Pilot training was an intense experience. We were healthy, college-educated, 22-year-old males, some married, a few with kids, and we were being paid to learn to fly jets. We thought we were the luckiest guys in the world. First, we flew light aircraft, a Cessna nicknamed the Maytag because it was our first chance to wash out of the program. Eventually, about a third of the class would wash out of the program. At one point, I almost washed out, but with the help of a great instructor, I made it through. After the Maytag, we moved on to basic jet training, and I thought that flying around at 300 miles an hour has got to be as good as it gets. But it got better. After about 6 months, we moved up to supersonic jets. You pull on your G-suit, a green nylon inflatable set of chaps that help you avoid blackouts during tight turns and aerobatic maneuvers. You grab your parachute and your helmet, and you head out to the plane for the pre-flight inspection. We joked about kicking the tires and lighting the fires, but the checklist is about that thick, and you better get it right if you want to graduate, and also if you want to survive. You climb in, you run your cockpit checks, you start engines. Your ass is strapped to an ejection seat, so when you're ready to taxi, you pull the safety pin and you hold it up so the crew chief on the ground can see it. so that now he knows that rocket you're sitting on is armed. You give him the signal for chocks out, and as you pull out of your parking spot, the chief looks you over, gives you the thumbs up if there are no fuel leaks or mechanical issues, and then snaps you a salute as you head for the runway. When you're cleared for takeoff, you taxi into position. Put your feet on the brakes, bring the throttles up to 100%, wait a few seconds for those engines to wind up. Then you release the brakes, push the throttles into afterburner. And there's a saying that pilots use about jets: the faster you go, the faster you go faster. At 150 miles an hour, you bring the nose up, you're airborne. The landing gear comes up, the flaps come up. And now if you bring that stick back smartly, you'll be at 5,000 feet of altitude, and the end of the runway is still right there. After takeoff, you enter a complex system of aircraft navigation and communication with dozens of people on the ground, and they monitor your progress. They tell you when to turn, how quickly to climb or descend, where to level off, when it's safe to land. If the weather is bad, they will bring you down through thick gray clouds until at the last moment you break out and that strip of concrete with faint white lights appears before you. Now you transition from listening to that voice in your headset and watching those gauges on the instrument panel, and once again you pick up visual cues at 200 miles an hour to safely land your aircraft. I was in awe of this 800-mile-an-hour machine. And the day that I soloed in that aircraft changed my life forever. But flying is about more than systems and engineering and gee whiz performance. You've all flown. It's magic, right? You leave the realm of gravity and you do things you've never done before. And we could loop and roll these aircraft, and we did, often with a wingman right there beside us. And as we'd arc over the top, upside down, that other aircraft would just float, attached by invisible threads against the backdrop of the sky. And if conditions were just right, vapor trails would erupt from his wingtips. Flying then was a thing of beauty, a poetic experience. Like writing a haiku across the sky, you have rules, but within those rules, you can do amazing things. And the landscape of the sky is more majestic, more peaceful, and sometimes more frightening than anything here on Earth. A week before I graduated, Kathy and I got married. And then we went to my first assignment at Keesler Air Force Base on the Gulf Coast. Now, I would be an instructor pilot training Thai, Vietnamese, and Laotian cadets to fly. The best student pilot I ever had was a young Laotian man who could fly the airplane better than I could from day one. That was a real eye-opener for me, supposedly the exceptional American boy. Later, I was transferred to the Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs, and there I trained cadets to fly in the same Cessna Maytags where I had started my Air Force career.
The biggest battle I was involved in was an all-day affair. We were doing a company-wide sweep through a VC area, taking a lot of gunfire. So we called in artillery on our own position. We hunkered down tight against a dike, we pulled our helmets down low, and we blew the shit out of that area for an hour. Afterward, we got up and we got back online, and not 10 feet in front of us, a VC jumped up. We killed him. We killed him and at least 14 other people that day. Now, our colonel was excited. This was a big battle for us. He had called in the brigade commander from Saigon. They're flying above us in a Huey helicopter, at least a dozen people on that chopper. I'm talking to the colonel. I'm the radio guy. We hear a huge explosion, and I look up, and there's a giant smoke ring rising up in the sky, and a shell, just a shell of the Huey, seemed to be floating to the ground. See, the Huey had raised up, smacked a gunship that was coming in, disintegrated the gunship, and the Huey lost its rotor. The smoke ring raised up, the helicopter crashed on the ground and exploded. 15 of them dead, 15 of us dead. Now, another platoon had to go police the American bodies, not ours, thank the good Lord Jesus. We took a prisoner we had captured earlier in the day. We had him tied up, leaning against a hooch. We're in a little semicircle. Sake takes out his knife, and he pitches it toward the prisoner. Prisoner flinches. Tom went to get his knife, gets back to the circle, throws it a little closer. The third time Tom went to get his knife, I said to him hard, I said, Tom, we're going to kill him, or we're not going to kill him. We're not going to torture him. You pussy, says Tom. But we stopped. Now, this same guy, now you got to know, Tom's a football player. He was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings before the Army drafted him. Tom comes running through the barracks. He's got a wounded Vietnamese child in his arms. The kid had been outside. A beam collapsed on him, something. He's hurt bad. Tom's racing into the medic to save his life. And Tom's crying his eyes out. That was some crazy world, Vietnam. I was there for 11 months and 1 week. I left there April 10th, 1970. 30 hours after leaving the war. I'm a civilian, and I'm flying to L.A., going to visit my auntie. She took me to see hair. We went to Disneyland. There's a picture of me standing with Goofy.
The Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting?
I went to A school, Great Lakes. I was trained as a hospital corpsman. It's the Navy's version of a medic. It was 13 weeks due to the needs in Vietnam. My first duty station was at Bremerton Naval Hospital, built in the early 1900s. In an old Navy base, we had dry docks where we refitted and rebuilt aircraft carriers and ships and Nuki subs. It was 38 miles from my parents' front door and the girl I'd gone out with in high school. That was nice. She'd gotten a full academic ride at UW in mathematics and psych. She was pretty smart, but not in a hoity-toity kind of way. She was pretty down to earth. We got married at 19. So I was at Bremerton for a year, and I got orders and shipped out for the 1st Marine Division, Field Medical Service School, Camp Pendleton, California. Did a lot of interesting things. There 2 years, and I discharged from my obligation and went to the Navy Reserve. After all that, I felt called to go to Azusa Pacific Bible College. I was going to be an art teacher. When I was there a couple of semesters, started to feel really conflicted. My pastor, good friend, he'd broken his leg. His wife, another good friend, she was having emotional crises around that. And my wife was going nuts, really. Unfortunately, she was having manic and psychotic episodes, which later be diagnosed as bipolar disorder. I was, 22? I know I felt really grown up at the time, but I look back and I say, son, I have no idea how you kept your head above water. You were so lost. Clearly, I had issues too, but that somehow was not important. There were people around me that I was acutely aware of that had needs, but there was nothing that I could do about them. So I headed back north. My mother, my dad were there. My mother is a force of nature. She's 96 almost. She was an Army nurse in the Second War in Korea. My dad, the lifer, he was pretty distant. So my mother was a mother and a father to me. Dad struggled. He tried, but he was an alcoholic struggling with undiagnosed PTSD. And the colonel's daughter had lots of advice, and she said, you need to go to nursing school. So that's what I did. Yeah, I was not quite sure of all the reasons why I was doing it, but it really felt like the right thing. In 1981, I graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, courtesy of the GI Bill, and a BA in Psych, and a BA in Sociology. And those studies made all the difference in my life path after that, but the seeds were all planted as a young hospital corpsman in the U.S. Navy.
After basic training, I went off to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, to train as a medic. 9 weeks of intense medical training to prepare you just enough to know nothing. My first duty assignment was Fort Benning, Georgia, home of the Army Infantry. When I wasn't training with the unit, I was providing individual medical coverage for airborne, officer candidate school, Pathfinder, and Ranger schools. All in all, it was a pretty great first assignment. My third year, I rotated back to Fort Devens to finish out my commitment. The main reason I came back to Fort Devens was to be closer to my high school girlfriend. Well, she dumped me. But the good news is that's where I met my wife in 1978.
Straight out of basic training, I was sent to Fort Gordon, Georgia to complete my telecommunications training. There I was the academic honor graduate, promoted again, and was rewarded with a few weeks of hometown recruiting duty. Then I went to my first permanent duty assignment at Fort Devens, Massachusetts. It's where my sister was assigned. I was assigned to a medical unit. Telecommunications vehicles would accompany them to the field during training exercises. When I wasn't in the field training with them, I worked at the Post Communication Center. Every message that was sent or received on post went through us. We worked with magnetic tape, precursor to today's CDs. They worked out of these huge refrigerator-sized machines. You'd receive a message, decipher it, and send it to the appropriate headquarters. If you made a mistake with a top secret message, you'd be in trouble. Fort Devens is also where I met my husband in 1978.
We were living in the same building, but assigned to different units.
I had just bought a brand new silver gray Toyota Corolla.
One day after a snowstorm, I was out cleaning the snow off my car, and this pretty girl walks up.
Thanks for cleaning off my car.
That's my car.
No, that's my car.
I looked. It was a four-door, but I couldn't tell with the snow.
He had just bought a silver gray Toyota Corolla too.
But mine was a two-door.
He wasn't interested in a Oh, yeah, that's right. When did you buy your car?
The 22nd.
That's when I bought my car.
Isn't that amazing?
Where are you from?
New Hampshire.
Get out of here. That's where I'm from. But he wasn't interested in a relationship. I could tell. It took me about 6 weeks to get him interested.
She was a pretty good-looking girl. But then she went off to Korea.
I was sad. I didn't want to go to Korea.
And my time was up in June. I was going home and joining the reserves.
We couldn't do anything about it.
What are you going to do?
So off I went. Don't forget to write. In Korea, I was really busy. Our unit was in charge of placing up a brand new automated multimedia exchange communication center. We worked 60 to 72 hours a week. In my free time, I was on the post basketball and football teams. My roommate, whose duty assignment in Korea was just about over, introduced me to a college student who was Korean. He was an English major. She said that if I helped him with his English conversation, he'd show me around Seoul. That's what she had done while she'd been there, and she'd just be turning him over to me. So that's what we did. He showed me around the city, and I further exposed him to the English language. 11 months passed, and then he asked me to go visit his college in Incheon and to see MacArthur Park. There we were, standing looking at this huge statue of MacArthur when he says to me, "I won't take you back to post unless you promise to marry me." I walked away crying. I was stuck. He was holding me hostage. I didn't know enough of the Korean language to get myself back on post. I couldn't trust the Korean police. And to top it off, there was a countrywide midnight curfew enforced by shooting you on sight. I finally realized that I had to rely on him to get me back to post, so I went back and I found him. I tried everything I could think of to convince him that I couldn't marry him. Nothing worked, so in the end, I told him I'd marry him. By then, it was too late to make it back to post, so we had to find a hotel. I walked into my hotel room. My senses were on high alert. The chickens squawking in the yard, the light coming from the rice paper walls, the doorknob without a lock, the smell of drying fish and kimchi, the rock hard rice pillow. I heard my door open. It was bad. It's just as bad as you're thinking it was. My senses left me. I left me. I was consumed by the room's blackness. The only thing I couldn't blank out were his teeth. They were ugly. I concentrated on them and kept saying to myself, "Don't kiss me, please. Don't kiss me." It was my way of protecting myself as the rest of my body was violated. I was 20 years old. I had a boyfriend back home. I was 3 weeks from making it back to New Hampshire. The next day of the trade ride back to Seoul, I thought, say something, tell somebody what happened. But I wasn't trusting anybody by then. I got back on post. I took one step past the guard and I said, "He's not coming on post with me." I stood close as I could to the guard and the Korean walked away quickly. I walked back to my room and I told my best friend what had happened. I didn't want to tell the military police because then I'd have to stay in country for a trial. So instead I told another soldier and he made sure that Korean was never allowed on post again. His Korean wife took care of things too. That's how I left the Army and Korea. That's how I left active duty in Korea. K-Sikia.
In AIT, I was trained in the use of the Bradley Fighting Vehicle, a 25-ton armored personnel carrier with a 25-millimeter chain gun and a couple of TOW anti-tank missiles. They could ford 4 feet of water or even float with the aid of a skirt held out by these spindly little rods. That was scary. A couple of rounds through that skirt would send the whole thing to the bottom very quickly, and there were 9 guys in there in full gear and boots. It's very hard to swim in combat boots, even for strong swimmers, and I was never a very good swimmer. I was then stationed in Aschaffenburg, West Germany. In Germany, you can drink beer at any age, in public, and even on the job. And in the Army, drinking was strongly encouraged. Everything was a drinking game. And if you didn't join in, or were the least bit reluctant to drink yourself into a stupor, then they called you a pussy. I'd only tasted alcohol a couple times before I joined the Army, but I did my best to fit in. I vividly remember puking up a stream of brown foam and then being clapped on the back when I returned to the game. Aside from that brief moment of camaraderie, however, I didn't really mesh well with the troops. They'd go out every night and hit the bars, and I'd be in my room writing long programs in Pascal on my IBM PC clone. I was labeled a nerd and a barracks rat. This was towards the end of the Cold War. We called the East Germans rads. They used to say, "Kill a commie for mommy, kill a rad for dad." We spent long hours on maneuvers that we called field problems. I can remember trying to sleep in 10-degree weather with 105 and 120 millimeter cannons going off all night long. We learned to identify Soviet tanks, how to find and defuse mines, and how to survive undetected behind enemy lines. We also learned a lot about nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare, but nobody really expected war to break out. Just a few years later, the wall was torn down, and the Cold War was over. With all this training, though, they didn't really take advantage of anybody's unique skills. They just put people in interchangeable positions and expected them to perform equally. I was always heavily influenced by robotics. I used to think of the situations we were training for and wonder, why are we putting men at risk? I thought we could save a lot of lives and be a more effective fighting force. So I built a small robot, and I put a mock turret on it, and I showed it around to the guys in the barracks. Then I modified it with a non-lethal weapon, and I used it to simulate capturing a guard post. Guy I knew was pulling guard duty at the time, so I was pretty sure I wouldn't get in trouble. I just wanted to show what robots were capable of. People said, yeah, that's cute, but back in the 80s, they didn't get it. Now they do. Now the military uses all kinds of robotic systems. But back then, they just didn't see the potential. Maybe if I'd been a more persuasive person, I could have convinced more people, and thousands of soldiers who perished in Iraq and Afghanistan would still be alive today.
In 1983, I received my commission in the Army Reserve as a nurse corps officer. I had my years of active duty. I could drill again, make a little extra money. I was assigned to a 1,000-bed field hospital. I knew my mother would be proud at least, but my wife didn't much care for the Navy, or the Army in that case. And if your spouse doesn't support you in the service, there's one of a couple things that'll happen. You'll get some orders, you'll ship out, you won't come back, you'll send postcards, you'll get a divorce maybe, or you'll resign or leave the service. I resigned my commission. In 1985, our daughter was born, and we wanted her to grow up in a stable community. So I built us a house in a heterogeneous cul-de-sac in the great Pacific Northwest. But I missed the Navy. I loved the Navy, but I really hated the Navy. It's kind of like a relationship, an iffy one. You exploit them, they exploit you. So in 1989, I received my commission again in the service, in the Navy this time, back to the Navy, in the nurse corps. My wife appreciated it this time because the money was pretty good, and she was able to stay home and be a full-time at-home mom, and she was a good mother. She kept having these bad breaks, though, and they weren't getting any better. I did a lot of dancing around trying to make things work to help, but I was trying to be rational in an irrational and reactive environment. As in life, so in the military. In 1991, early in 91, I was activated for Desert Storm. Before that, my unit had trained medical personnel to do trauma care, medical care in theater, and they were trained to go and went to Desert Shield and Desert Storm. They would be at what we call the forward edge of the battle area. They would be in the shit, and they were. At that time, we didn't know if Saddam Hussein had nukes or not, and so we were training our people in conventional warfare, but also in nuclear, chemical, and biological warfare. As an officer, one of my duties was to stand up in front of my people and lecture them about durable powers of attorney, wills, bank accounts, having their affairs in order, that sort of a thing. Every meeting, as I stood before them, in my mind's eye, I saw that room begin to fill with stacks of body bags. That was really disturbing. These were my people. Some of them were my age, from Vietnam and before, but the rest of them were a lot younger. I liked these people. They were young people like I had been as a young hospital corpsman. Nothing ever once really validated my feelings or anybody else's. So we just set that aside. I carried on. I made sure that anybody and everything that I was responsible for was taken care of to the best I could. My job was to take care of my people, no matter the cost. Take care of my people. In '95, I went to the Gulf with a combat intelligence unit. And after that, my personal, physical, and mental health crashed in on me.
There was a badge you could earn called the Expert Infantryman Badge. I didn't get the chance to earn one myself because I was assigned to the sniper course. We filled thousands of sandbags and used them to lay out the course and to build a bunker. Troops were supposed to move from cover to cover under simulated fire provided by a type of laser tag called Miles gear. They made me a sniper. They put me behind cover about 100 yards back. First guy popped up, I shot him immediately. Same for the second guy. The sergeant says,
"Let him get a little further."
So I let him get a little further. Then they moved me about another 50 yards back. Didn't matter. I had no problem picking them off one by one. I was about the best shot in my company at the time. Sometime later, we're all bragging about what we had done, and I told them not a single guy made it through my line, which I was proud of. Shortly after that, a guy came up from behind me and punched me right in the face. I'd never been sucker punched before, so it actually took me a minute to realize what he'd done, and he'd left right after. So I followed him to confront him. That's when I learned that everyone who didn't make it through the course didn't get their EIB badge. Everyone I'd shot failed, and they were pissed. Nobody told me. If they had, I would have missed. Things really started happening after that. I'd get the shit kicked out of me in hand-to-hand combat training in the barracks, which I later found out was against the rules. Other rules that were broken were no punching in the face and no kicking in the nuts. Sometime later, things continued to get worse. I tried fighting as best as I could, but I wasn't very strong, though I spent every day in the gym working out, and I drank weight gain shakes constantly. I just don't have the build for it, and most of the guys I served with were a lot stronger than me. The attacks got worse. One day, someone came up behind me and hit me in the back of the head with a baseball bat. It was dark by the time I woke up in a pool of my own vomit. Another time, we were playing combat football. I didn't have the ball. I was just running along the sidelines when I was suddenly T-boned by a couple of guys who had 50 pounds on me. The guy in front of me did a quick 90-degree turn right into me, and I didn't even know the guy behind me was there. I felt my entire spine crack, and they put me in the hospital, and they put me on painkillers and muscle relaxers. But things kept getting worse. I soon found out that rules don't matter if nobody enforces them. My life was threatened, and my body violated. I soon started carrying a knife with me wherever I went and was forced to pull it on a soldier. He was stronger than me, and he was a black belt, and he could have hurt me a lot worse than he already had. But maybe if somebody got stabbed, the wrong people might take notice. He left me alone after that, but soon I had a surprise inspection and my knife was confiscated. I have no idea how far up the chain of command things went. My life started deteriorating after that. I requested a transfer, then I requested to speak to a therapist of some kind, but they just kept blowing me off. Then, one day, at the range, I found myself contemplating the unthinkable. Without realizing I was doing it, I pocketed an extra magazine, and I started noticing myself watching where everybody armed was located and where the cover was. Under the right circumstances, anyone could be a monster, and I almost became one that day. I immediately went to my CO and told him what had happened. I didn't want anybody else to get hurt. First, they put me on suicide watch. Then they put me in a psych ward for a couple weeks. Then they sent me home. And that was the end of my military career.
After I married Jay, moving was bittersweet. I sold the house that Carrie had grown up in, and we moved to Groton, Connecticut. We always lived off base, in a duplex just outside of Groton this time. Then Jay's old roommate was going out to sea, so we lived in his townhouse for about a year. Our next duty station was in Virginia Beach. We rented a townhouse just outside of Dam Neck Base. Carrie had a wonderful high school to go to, and I could almost walk to work at Dam Neck Base. Jay's ship was stationed in Norfolk. Jay was assigned to the USS Comte de Grace DD-974. She was a beautiful ship. Jay's job in the Navy was Chief Damage Controlman, and he was responsible for maintenance of the ship, repair division, gas-free engineering, training drills, and fire marshal. I really felt that I was part of the ship. I got on good with the Master Chief. He knew I was older and only had a daughter at home to take care of, so he asked me if I would be the ombudsman for our ship. The ombudsman is a civilian liaison between the ship and the family members. Your job is to give answers and to provide support. When the ship was out, the Master Chief would message me and tell me if they were going to be in port or out of port. I had this old computer in my house where I would put a message on telling the families where the ship was at this time. The wives of the sailors could call in as often as they wanted. I'd change the outgoing message as frequently as I was updated to by the Master Chief. When my brother was in Vietnam, my mother didn't have all these wonderful things to rely on.
I raised my daughter in the Northwest until 2003. She was 18. Her mother continued to have these worsening breaks. I felt like such a shit, lost, confused, torn, guilty. But for my own well-being and for my daughter's, I decided I needed to divorce. My daughter chose to come with me, and we returned to my childhood home in Westmoreland. I reconnected with my junior high sweetheart, Debbie. We married. Debbie understands the military, and she honors it, and she respects me. I was still in the reserve, but I never drilled again. I just couldn't. No matter what I would have done, Deb would have supported me. So I just kept going. I'd hoped to keep going until I had enough years, but that just wasn't going to happen. In 2006, the U.S. Navy Department sent me a lovely suitable for framing certificate, thanking me for my 34 years of on and off service, rather like, thanks for coming and please be going.
Jay was out to sea a lot in the 5 years we were stationed in Virginia Beach. He was home 75 nights. They did 2 Unitas, which are like goodwill tours to South America and down around the Horn. They were in Haiti, too, when things were pretty hairy. My daughter and I were mostly on our own. We just did our thing. We kept busy. I took a computer class during the day. I had an evening job. Carrie was old enough that she could stay home alone. For a while, I ran a service desk in a Kmart. Then I was cash office supervisor at the NEX on Dam Neck Base. Or we'd go to care group meetings. The wives and the children would get together, including the captain's wife and Master Chief's wife. We would help each other out. You could tell who was struggling and who wasn't. We'd figure things out for the ones who were struggling, shopping groups, babysitters, that kind of thing. We were all there to support each other. I didn't mind being alone. After my first divorce, I stuck out on my own. I had my own apartment. My second marriage was a little more involved. He had 2 kids, and I just assumed the mothering role. So being married to Jay and just having Carrie was kind of a vacation. But it wasn't as easy for other wives. Some had 4 kids under the age of 7. Some of them were good at it, but others weren't. They're constantly calling, overwhelmed, needing help. Sometimes you'd have to say to them, look, maybe you're not built for this. Maybe you should go to your hometown with your family until your husband comes back. There were, of course, many moments when I missed Jay. I took Carrie to college in New Hampshire on my own. It was the day after Princess Diana was killed. We were both Princess Di fans, and we woke up that morning in the motel. We found out she had been killed, and we were so sad. When I dropped her off, I felt like I'd lost my best friend. I drove back to Virginia from New Hampshire, 17 hours on my own with our dog Tucker. That's the kind of thing a wife needs her husband for. Ship homecomings were so exciting. Those were the best. You would meet the ship down at the pier, such fanfare and happiness, everybody crying and laughing. And Jay would bring Carrie and I some amazing gifts. I still have a jacket he brought me made of emu leather from Uruguay. It was always an adjustment when he came back. Everything revolved around him. Now you'd have to find time to go to the dry cleaners to do his uniforms. And you changed your schedule so it coincided with his, things like that. I remember saying to the women in one of the care group meetings, when he's home, it's all consuming. But when he's gone, it's like a break. Take advantage of it. On the first Unitas deployment, I found myself not feeling well. I was laying low. We were having trouble with a sailor's wife who was pregnant. She was desperate to have her husband home, so she got a doctor to lie for her. It was all very stressful, and I started having chest pains. At the hospital, I had a heart catheterization, and they found I had major blockages in my heart. I ended up flatlining twice during the procedure. Poor Jay was in South America during all this. The doctor called him and said, "Well, we lost her, but we got her back." Apparently, he just dropped to his knees. Master Chief took the phone from him and finished the conversation with the doctor. It was a bad scare. I ended up having 2 stents put in that time. So they didn't send home the pregnant wife's husband. They sent home my husband so he could take over my ombudsman duties and take care of me, because I'd be out of the loop for about 3 weeks. The Secretary of the Navy was on his ship and had a 747 held for him so he could get home to me. He couldn't believe the things I had to deal with. An ancient computer, people screaming at you, or calling at 2 in the morning because they didn't get a letter. All kinds of things like that. It really wore you out. When the ship came in, he went to the Master Chief and said, "I cannot believe you don't pay your ombudsman." After my heart troubles, I adopted a new motto. Does anyone know what Navy stands for? Never again volunteer yourself. Our next duty station was Great Lakes, Illinois, where Jay was training incoming sailors. He worked 12 to 14 hours a day, so when he was off, it was wonderful. We had a great time. I got a job that had nothing to do with the base or the Navy. Jay retired after 20 years in 2003.
Finally, after 5 years of dating, I convinced him to marry me. At the time, I was working at the Post Communication Center at Fort Devens, but this time as a civilian supervisor.
It was the best thing that ever happened to me. We were both in the reserves. We drilled 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks during the summer.
And I did what?
I don't know.
No, we didn't. Not yet.
It's very hard to tell your own story. It's harder than you think, actually.
That's his line, not mine.
She says something before that.
Go ahead, go from there, Mike. We both went to high school on the GI Bill.
Quit your job to be.
Oh, my line was, I quit my job to raise my family and to go to college.
That's right. We're back on track now. We were both going to college here at Keene State on the GI Bill. I received a degree in business.
And I received a Bachelor of Science in Education. For a while there, I was a drill sergeant on the weekend and a home economics teacher during the week. Never confused the two, but my students knew how to respond to, don't be sorry.
Be right.
Don't get angry.
Get results.
There's a right way and a wrong way to sew on a button, recruit.
Our daughter Melissa was born in 1982.
Our son Michael was born in 1983. It was a busy time.
Right around then, we started thinking about officer candidate school. I applied and was accepted. And so at age 27, after 9 years of enlisted service, I received my commission in 1984.
And I received my commission 2 years later.
My first assignment as a new lieutenant was in the 351st General Hospital in Chester, Vermont. There I got to meet and serve with a bunch of incredibly talented and dedicated medical professionals.
We were both in line to go to the Gulf for Desert Storm. I'd always said I'd go to Canada before I'd leave my kids. But when reality hit, I said, of course I'll go. I won't shirk my military duty. But the war was shorter than anticipated, so I didn't have to go. In
1996, I transferred to a training unit at Fort Devens. I was assigned as the officer in charge of the medical training team. And then 9/11 happened.
9/11 happened.
In early 2003, I was mobilized for the first time. My unit went to Fort Drum, where we trained medical units that were about to deploy to Iraq. It was a long, crazy year. It's brutally cold in upstate New York in February, and the logic of training for desert warfare in the snow kind of escaped all of us. But that's the Army. Not long after I returned from Fort Drum, I was asked to join a unit that was about ready to deploy to Iraq. I asked Pam what she thought about me going.
I said it's not my responsibility to tell him what to do. If he goes to war and gets killed, I'll feel guilty. If he stays and resents it, it's my fault.
Well, Michael and Melissa had graduated from high school by that time, so I figured they didn't need me quite as much. Following 3 months of pre-deployment training at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, our unit deployed to Mosul in northern Iraq. I was assigned as the senior operations officer in the 399th Combat Support Hospital. Line? No, next line.
Next line.
We provided what the Army called level 3 care. Our business was trauma. We treated American forces, coalition forces, Iraqi army and police, civilians, and of course the enemy. We treated whoever was brought to us, and we treated them all as well as we could. Mosul was a very dangerous place in 2006. Our tour coincided with the bloodiest period of the war, commonly referred to as the Surge. Our hospital was located about a quarter mile from the cement barriers that separated us from the city. On October 17th, our second night there, we came under a pretty significant mortar attack. 13 rounds landed within 50 meters of our location. Danger close. I quickly came to the realization that I may not make it out of that place alive. Oddly enough, I became resigned to that. Even more odd, I became good with it, and I never gave it another thought. I'm pretty sure that's a common theme for folks serving in a war zone. Next. I don't recall any conversations about whether or not the war was just. It didn't really matter to us. Our reality was that we were there to save lives, the only noble job in the insanity of war. And make no mistake about it, war is and always will be total insanity.
What do I do?
In 2000.
Yeah.
2004.
2004, I got a phone call from the Army reassigning me from the IRR into the active reserve. But the Army was so far behind in their paperwork, I wasn't mobilized until the middle of 2005. I was 48 years old at the time. In the 27 years since I'd last been on active duty, the way women were treated in the Army had changed somewhat. Back in the day, the saying was, you could prove yourself two ways as a female in the Army. One, you could be a good soldier, or two, you could be a good lay. Well, I was always a good soldier. By the time I was mobilized, most of the old guard had retired, and the younger soldiers were used to having females around. It was all in line with societal change. I was assigned to a training division. Our training team worked mostly out of the Reserve Center in Bristol, Rhode Island. It was supposed to be a one-year activation. That 1 year turned into 9 years of active duty.
In early 2008, I was mobilized for the third time, assigned to a training battalion at Fort Dix, New Jersey. My job was to coach and mentor senior staff members who were about to deploy. Halfway through that mobilization, I was fortunate enough to be promoted to colonel. In the spring of 2010, I was mobilized for the 4th time, this time assigned as a commander of a medical task force that was headed to Afghanistan.
I said, fine, but it has to be the last time.
Okay, dear. Our unit arrived in country in mid-May 2010. I was serving as the deputy commander of Task Force Medical, responsible for the combat health support delivery system in northern and eastern Afghanistan. I spent a lot of time with the wounded. It was the first thing I did every morning and the last thing I did every night. I thought it was my duty to sit and talk with them if they were able, to hear their stories, to comfort them and reassure them. It was both the best and the worst part of my job. The amount of human suffering at that hospital weighed heavily on our caregivers. On average, we evacuated 30 casualties a day to Landstuhl, Germany. 7 days a week, nearly 10,000 in the year that I was there. As a senior commander on the base, I attended over 100 fallen comrade ceremonies, solemn affairs in which the caskets of the dead are placed onto aircraft for their final journey home.
Is this where I go? Both transitions back from Iraq and Afghanistan were difficult. I said to him, I know you'd think you're the same as you were before you left, but you're not.
I don't think humans can witness that kind of suffering and not be changed by it. After Iraq and Afghanistan, I went to see what the VA calls readjustment counselors. I was diagnosed with PTSD, but I chose not to apply for monetary benefits. This didn't seem like the right thing to do. And a few extra bucks isn't going to help that anyway. Within the first 6 months of my return from Iraq, 2 of my fellow unit members committed suicide. Another one took her own life 1 week before our 10-year reunion. In my 5th and final mobilization, I served as the Chief of Global Force Management for a medical command in Atlanta. But I was tired by then. Having served nearly 8 years out of the previous 11 away from my family in pretty high-stress jobs. And so, September 2014, after 39 years, 2 months, and 21 days, I hung it up. And I haven't worked a frickin' day since.
My last command was unpleasant. Let me explain it this way. When I first got to the unit, I received above a 90 on all my physical fitness test scores, earning me the Army's Physical Fitness for Excellence Award. In 3 months, my health had deteriorated so badly that I couldn't even take the physical fitness test. It was mostly due to unhealthy stress and a poor command climate. The database our unit was using to evaluate deploying units' command staffs was new. During the initial training, I paid attention, and it turned out I knew the data system better than anybody else in the unit. I knew I was the best because they assigned me to train all the new incoming personnel. I knew we were not performing to our capabilities. I knew we could do better. I was a major, but I was the lowest ranking officer in the unit. It was a constant uphill battle every day to improve our training scenarios. My supervisor was leaving because of the stress and the command climate. All kinds of people were transferring out of the unit. Not me. I said, I don't leave. I don't bail. I get the job done. Well, it almost killed me. I got really sick. Mike was deployed, so I didn't have him to count on as my physical and mental health continued to decline. I missed the kids. I felt guilty for the extra burden they were shouldering because Mike and I weren't home. Eventually, I was transferred to a Wounded Warrior program. I felt like a failure. I didn't want to be there with the amputees and wounded. But if you needed a medical discharge, that's where you went. It took the Army 15 months to diagnose my facial pain. I had trigeminal neuralgia. I'd gained 40 pounds from the side effects of medication, and I couldn't sleep at night because of the pain. After two surgeries, I finally got my medical discharge, and in 2014, I retired from the Army. If that last command had been my first unit, I never would have stayed in the Army. But most of my other experiences were great.
We were born before the wind, also younger than the sun. Yeah, the bonnie boat was one as we sail into the mystic. I can now hear the sailors cry.
We decided to move back to New Hampshire after Jay retired, which is where I'm from. Jay's from Minnesota. He worked as a roofer for a while. He grew a beard. That was pretty exciting for both of us. Then he worked as a security guard at Vermont Yankee for at least 12, 13 years. We're grandparents, too. My son Robert has 2 daughters and a son with his wife Tori, and my daughter Carrie has 2 daughters with her husband John. Now Jay works as a delivery driver for People's Linen. What's funny is I think he's happy to be back in a uniform. When he puts that uniform in the hamper, he folds it. It's kind of cute. We talk about missing the Navy. Mostly we miss the people. Everyone went their separate ways, but we keep in touch through Facebook these days. And we have a family in Pennsylvania that we try to get together with at least twice a year. Since we've been out of the Navy, I've had 3 cardiac ablations. I'm all done with trying to fix my heart. Every time I had an ablation, I was under anesthesia for 7 hours, so my mind has become really scattered and forgetful at this young age of 62. I take it easy. I do what I can when I can do it. I have a good support system with my girlfriends. We all have personal issues. One of us has even survived cancer. They say misery loves company, but we have a good time because we drink wine and laugh until it hurts.
I flew east and back to my family. My friends and my family proceeded to save my life as far as I'm concerned. I was back and forth between Manchester and Keene about a bicycle. I got a part-time job clearing brush, cutting lawns, planting trees. I tried to get back into Keene State, and I worked hard at it. But, you know, I was pulled out of American society for 2 years, and while I was away, the country did a 180. I mean, I changed, but the country changed as well. When I was in high school, I remember getting threatened with expulsion because I wore my pants too tight. When I came back, kids were smoking dope in school. It was I got involved with anti-war stuff here. I went to the last great anti-war rally in Washington, D.C. I had 2 years of just letting it all go, but there's some stuff you can't let go.
Well, I'd really enjoyed teaching flying. But I knew I did not want to make a career of the Air Force. I'd been moving around my whole life, and I was ready to settle down. The war was over. I felt lucky that I hadn't been sent to Southeast Asia, and I felt good about the 2 squadrons that I'd served with, particularly training those young Southeast Asian men to go home and defend their own countries. I'm genuinely ashamed of the lives and the natural resources that we wasted in Vietnam, supposedly fighting communism, a system of government that only a few years later failed of its own accord. But I've always been proud that I chose to serve. In June of 1974, I left the service, and with the help of the GI Bill, I got an MBA at Cornell University, went to work for a large company. Shortly thereafter, they moved us to the West Coast. So much for settling down. So I left and joined a brokerage firm here in New England, and I spent 25 years helping people manage their investments. That was really a teaching job, something the Air Force had shown me that I enjoyed doing.
When I got back to the States, my back was still injured, and soon I was out of meds. I went to the VA hospital in Bedford where my grandfather had gone, but they refused to treat me. So did every other VA I went to. I stayed with my grandmother for a while, but I was in physical pain and emotional anguish, and soon I found myself homeless. I've been periodically homeless since then. I've lived in tents and cars, and even in an unused boat once. Every time I move to a new area, I survey the tactical situation, and I dig a foxhole. I was homeless in Keene for about 3 years, moving from my foxhole to an abandoned building downtown to a van that I bought and modified for use as a low-cost RV. Over the years, I've tried to access programs supposedly in place to help homeless veterans, but they don't seem to exist in real life. If they did, we wouldn't have 150,000 homeless veterans in America today. I've got a roof over my head now, but even when I didn't, I managed okay. I took care of myself. I never got addicted to drugs, and I almost always worked, even if I didn't make enough to afford an apartment. In the end, I didn't even get the GI Bill. I've been fighting the VA for about 30 years now. A few days before my discharge, they told me they were changing it from a medical to honorable, which at the time I thought was a good thing. But it turns out they just used it to deny my benefits. As far as the GI Bill, you have to serve at least 18 months unless you're injured in the line of duty. I was, but my records don't reflect that.
Well, I'm still receiving treatment. I get shots in my head, neck, and shoulders for the nerve pain, others in my hip for an injury. I have bone spurs in my heels, and I wear a mouth splint. I received extensive counseling, and I still take antidepressants daily. A few other things, but I'm doing fine. Transition from the military to the civilian world isn't always easy. It's a whole different social structure. In the military, you look everybody in the eye when you're walking down the street. See who's going to salute who. It's about respect. You say hello to everybody. You do that in the civilian world, and people look at you like you're crazy, or they think you want something from them. I think civilians sometimes forget that we're all like them. We were all civilians once.
I think my deployments took a lot out of me. For over 2 years, I witnessed daily the total failure of humanity. The truth is, the stories I've shared tonight don't even begin to describe the madness of war. I didn't sleep well for a while, but I'm much better now. I'm fine. I still don't go more than a few hours without thinking at least something about my war experiences. I'm hyperprotective and overcautious with my 3 grandchildren and kids in general. Watch out. Be careful. Pay attention. I think I've just seen too many gravely injured children. When others see little kids jumping off rocks and climbing trees and being kids, they see normality. I see kids one misstep away from disaster. I can't help it, and I know that it annoys my family. But mostly I regret not being there for Pam when she needed me the most. I have no doubt that my absence contributed to her health. Deployments are really hard on families, even under the best of circumstances. And they're often harder on the people who are left behind. And I wish more people would understand that.
I respect those who didn't serve in Vietnam as a matter of conscience, particularly those who found some other way of serving our country. I have no respect for those who found ways to get out of service during Vietnam simply because it would be too dangerous or just plain inconvenient. I firmly believe that we need a compulsory national service policy providing multiple forms of service for young men and young women, military, social, and community. Whenever people say to me, "Thank you for your service," I always think, no, thank you for letting me serve because I got so much out of my military career.
I had to retire 5 years ago at 60 for medical. I find myself trying to make sense out of all the things that happened, you know. Why did I become a corpsman? Why did I get married so young? How did I stay married? How come I never left? Why did I become a nurse? But mostly, my biggest question is, why did all those young people have to go into those body bags stacked like cordwood? Probably the greatest honor I ever had is tied to my care and caring for other people, and that was that I was allowed to be a funeral detail officer for over 30 military burials. I will never forget handing a flag to a 5-year-old boy for his father. So only recently did it come together for me in the work that we've done together as a group, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, that my job was to care. My job was to care. My purpose as an enlisted man, as an officer, as a husband, and as a father was to care. So that's what I did 16, 18 hours a day until I just couldn't do it anymore. For decades, I'd put myself aside. I'm no martyr. I just put myself aside to take care of other people. It's my job. Eventually, it just caught up with me. So now I work on doing what we've done, is validating other people's experiences and my own. And I've gotten so much from you guys. And I've realized that in order to care, we have to be able to care for ourselves first. And above all, we have to have compassion, but again, we must have compassion for ourselves.
I joined the Army so that I could go to college, but I still don't have a degree. I'm a very capable engineer, but my lack of credentials is an obstacle in the job market. I struggle with PTSD, insomnia, and depression. I worry that I have permanent damage from that baseball bat. I have severe memory issues. I forget appointments, names, faces, and I've even had total amnesia a couple times. People come up to me and they talk to me and I have no idea who they are. I'm an inventor and have made other people a lot of money. I'd like to get myself out of the financial hole I'm in, but I'm not sure how I can do that. I used to work as a CNC machinist at a local company which makes firearms accessories, and I was the only person there who could figure out the G-code for a new process to make sights, securing multi-million-dollar contracts for Ruger in the military. I had created the world's first robot swarm and invented a revolutionary new type of lawnmower. But patents aren't for guys like me anymore. They cost about 25 grand a piece, and that's not counting thousands of dollars every few years in maintenance fees. This is not the land of opportunity anymore. But I haven't given up. Every day I put at least a few hours into my business. I still build robots. I'm also designing and building 3D printers and other things. I also work for a local company assisting disabled individuals. It's not really my line of work, but I figured that helping others might bring some measure of peace to myself.
A few years ago, I attended a squadron reunion, and 2 of my Vietnamese student pilots were there. Each of them told me a harrowing tale of how they had escaped the South after the North took over. One eventually made it to the United States and settled in San Diego. The other had immigrated to Australia. He and his wife had come all the way from Perth in Western Australia to Ohio to attend this reunion of the squadron that 40 years earlier had taught him to fly. Their recollections of me were far more vivid than my recollections of them, and I was a little embarrassed by that. But one of the Vietnamese wives explained it to me. She said, in Vietnamese culture, the teacher is esteemed even more highly than the parents. What a lesson for us today. Both of these men were incredibly grateful for that experience that we had shared. At the same reunion, I encountered a couple of former instructor pilots from that squadron who had gone on to fly Agent Orange defoliation missions in Vietnam. Both were riddled with cancer. They weren't so grateful. I had a friend in pilot training. He was killed when his B-52 bomber was shot down over Hanoi, December 1972. When I heard that news, I just couldn't believe it. But I've been to the wall, and I've seen his name. We all thought we'd outlive the Air Force and go on to do other things with our lives. I was one of the lucky ones.
You've heard me say that in my family, girls and boys were not treated equal. Well, in the Army, I succeeded and succeeded again. I was promoted ahead of my peers. I was chosen for this team and that team. I received awards. It taught me that I was a professional soldier, that I was an honest person. I worked hard. I studied. I stayed fit. I am a female, and I am a worthy person.
The military did take from me, but overall, I think it gave me so much more. I met and served with so many great Americans in my travels. Men and women just like you and I, ordinary folks who, for whatever reason, raised their right hand and chose to serve. Except Larry, they dragged him away kicking and screaming. I think I proved myself as a good soldier, that I worked hard at my craft, and that I cared deeply about the mission and the troops that were under me. I'd do it all again tomorrow, except I don't think Pam would let me. Other than marriage and fatherhood, it was the most important determinant of who I am today. And here I am. I'm one very lucky man.
You know, if I don't share these stories now, I never will, right? I share them from my father. He never could. I share them for my son. He will never have to. I share them for Tom Sakel, who died in December. I tell these stories so that you can know that war and thank you for your service and war and thank you for your service and another war and thank you for your service. That's a dead-end street. 3 million people died in Vietnam and Asia. 60,000 Americans were killed. And more of us have committed suicide than died in battle. Some of us died there and just refused to fall down. If we don't tell these stories now, you would never know them. Larry Colby, United States Army Infantry.
Patricia Castle, Navy spouse and retired ombudsman.
Robert Ball, Lieutenant Commander, U.S. Navy, U.S. Army Nurse Corps.
Christopher Wells, PFC, United States Army.
Jim Talbert, Captain, United States Air Force.
Colonel Mike Kaloje, U.S. Army retired.
Pamela Cloje, Major, United States Army, retired.
Lift, hey!
Right step, march!